Hello everyone, Spirit of Thersites here. All of you are well aware that in America corporate power reigns supreme. Whatever the massive corporations of this country want almost always becomes law, and there's rarely much public discussion of that. We'll get into some of the reasons why that is the case and how that occurs. But the video is primarily focused on the abuses not of big oil or the big banks, but rather of what I would like to term Big Jesus. Let me explain. Sadly, American politics is dominated by people who have money. Our political system has become extraordinarily expensive. Elections, the cost to conduct a successful election, has skyrocketed, especially in the last 10 years. Even before that, studies have shown consistently that people at the top of the income distribution consistently get what they want and people at the bottom do not. When it comes to dividing up the spoils among the people who do get something from the government, it is very apparent that the more money that you have and the more money that you spend politically, the more that you get. This means that big businesses profit much more from the government than small businesses. Despite all of the rhetoric about helping out mom and pop restaurants and shoring up small business owners, the fact is that politicians only actually care about big business because big business sustains them, at least on a national level. On a state level, the scale is much smaller, and sometimes the interests involved are much weaker. Big Jesus, for instance, does not really have the same kind of national influence that it has at a state level because nationwide there are many industries which outweigh the influence of the amount of money that Big Jesus can put forward. However, on a state level, if you're in a state like, say, Kentucky, where there isn't a dominant industry, then Big Jesus can be quite influential and powerful. Big Jesus, therefore, can get government resources put into their coffers because not only do they raise a lot of money from their constituents and they can use that money to fund political candidates, but also churches have not been shy about telling their constituents how to go out and vote. And that can be very valuable to winning elections as well. So churches, especially mega churches, are very valuable to have on your side as a politician. Small churches are really too small to make a difference unless you live in a hamlet somewhere. I'm mostly only talking about megachurches, and more specifically, evangelical megachurches, the ones which preach things such as creationism. The reason why I am choosing to highlight the role of Big Jesus in Kentucky is to illustrate the role of money in politics more broadly. Many people who accept the idea sometimes need a concrete example in order to really feel the issue on an emotional or at least intuitive level. And I think that this example is both egregious enough and also insane enough that it should strike home for you if you've been someone who hasn't quite been able to get motivated by this issue in the past. Also, the scale on which this is occurring in terms of the dollar amounts is much more easily comprehensible than the amounts of money that the big banks took during the bailout. So, by the end of this video, if I have succeeded, then you too will join Bubbles in saying that something is fucky. At its core, neoliberalism is an ideology which states that the better big business does, the better we all do. We should by all means advance the interest of big business, and then all of that wealth that accumulates from them will trickle down and benefit the whole of society. If you still think that this view has validity, then you have not been living in the West for the last 40 plus years. Suffice it to say that in the 20s, when the Republicans took up their current conservative pro-business mantra, the idea was to deregulate and also to keep government very small in order to enrich business by not taxing them. In the neoliberal era, what effectively happened is that Republicans figured out that they could instead use the instruments of government in order to enrich corporations and keep the government around and use it as a vehicle to pump money into business. Over the course of the 80s and into the early 90s, Democrats effectively followed suit, and this led to a case where it became very difficult to pass overt legislation, to really go in for major spending projects that were discussed by the public. You will notice that there have been very few new departments founded since the early 1980s, with the exception, of course, of the post-9/11 things such as Homeland Defense and ICE. And the reason for that is that the new real spending priority battles occur during budget battles and during things like the transportation bill every 5 years. Republicans are just as spend happy as Democrats, but they do it behind closed doors and it never gets reported on. Their big spending projects are dedicated and directed tax breaks to various organizations and causes. Republicans tend to try to give these to big business, especially big oil and the big banks. Democrats also are big fans of the big banks, and they also are supported by big tech. In addition, there are attempts sometimes to get favorable social outcomes by providing different tax breaks for different behaviors. The Earned Income Tax Credit is one example of a tax credit which was made with a liberal intention, although it is all too typical of the neoliberal era that it is laughably inadequate, inefficient, and also relies upon the poorest and least educated people who would actually need it, knowing that it's there and knowing how to claim it. So this, again, is how this functions, and if you want to learn more about how politicians in the neoliberal era direct resources directly to corporations from the public coffers, I highly suggest you read Suzanne Mettler's The Submerged State. This book has been out for several years, and at this point you should be able to pick it up relatively cheaply. Now that we understand the general dynamics of national politics, let's go back to the state of Kentucky. It is one of the 7 poorest states in the nation, and at one point Kentucky was called Shoeless Kentucky, because people there could not afford shoes. It is no longer called that, but this is still the case for many residents of the state, broadly speaking. Eastern Kentucky and Western Kentucky are both noted for their high poverty rates. Eastern Kentucky in particular has suffered in recent decades as coal mines have shut down as they have been completely used up. Despite this, a lot of the wealthier people who control the state and live in Lexington, Frankfort, and Louisville still drive around with bumper stickers talking about how coal keeps the light on and it is the fuel of Kentucky's economy. This has not been true in many years, yet there are people who still believe it to be the case. Nonetheless, people who are aware of what's going on in other parts of the state have proposed many state projects in order to try to increase prosperity and alleviate suffering. Some of these projects include potentially building a University of Kentucky affiliate at Hazard, Kentucky, one of the poorest towns in the entire country. While this would not be a silver bullet solution to the area's problems, it would at least create some jobs, and would also have the benefit of being something that Kentuckians would have a chance to weigh in on and vote on. Politicians could run on or against the university at Hazard, and then people could vote on whether they want it by voting for or against that politician. It would be a transparent democratic process. But that's not how things went. Kentucky didn't have that much money to spend, but when they did decide that they could afford to invest in something, they chose to invest in a man named Ken Ham. Rather than funding a university at Hazard or any other kind of poverty relief effort, the state of Kentucky decided that they wanted to make Ken Ham, an Australian creationist, richer than Solomon. He had a proposal to build a creation museum, and the state wanted to give him millions and millions of dollars in tax breaks in order to make his dream of becoming wealthy on the backs of dumb Americans a reality. Ken Ham found a willing partner in Democratic Governor Steve Beshear. Yes, you heard me right. Steve Beshear, a Democratic governor, backed giving state money to a religious nutjob from Australia so that he could build a museum which gives no public benefit whatsoever to the state and people of Kentucky. As with any kind of shadow spending project, in this case it's not so much in the shadows, but it is still using the mechanism of a tax break or a loophole or a subsidy, Beshear had to try to justify this spending. His justification for the spending, aside from wanting to get a bunch of Christian votes, which he didn't say out loud but is obvious enough, is that this would create thousands of jobs near Petersburg, Kentucky, and that this would be a major economic stimulus. A couple of things need to be noted. Northern Kentucky is one of the more prosperous areas of the state. It's not far from Cincinnati. So if you're going to do an economic stimulus in Kentucky, you should do it in a poorer region of the state, which needs it more. And two, there's a such thing as a separation of church and state. Oh, and also three, the Creation Museum was not going to actually create very many jobs. It's not going to become something that would really make Petersburg explode, and most of the jobs will not be that well paid. But never mind that, Steve Beshear approved $43 million in tax breaks because he says that this will create jobs, and he allocated an additional $11 million in order to improve roads near Petersburg in order to facilitate the flow of traffic to the new Creation Museum. All told, that's $54 million to help Ken Ham build a museum. I don't remember how much money Ken Ham had to raise privately to build the Creation Museum itself, but I don't think it was $54 million. It was probably less than that. So Kentucky basically matched him on a one-for-one basis, for all practical intents and purposes, so that he could create a for-profit business which spreads religious propaganda and scientific disinformation. To be clear, I have nothing against the idea of someone using private funds to create a museum which promotes whatever worldview they happen to support. It is fine that private individuals donated money and built a creation museum. What else are people with deep pockets and shallow minds to do, after all? But where I draw the line is when you get public money, which could go to much more important things, being spent on a boondoggle to enrich a random Australian nut job. Not only that, but this museum fails to really live up to the promise of creating public good. If you live in the area, you can't get a job there unless you subscribe to creationism. Most Christians, even in Kentucky, contrary to popular belief, are not creationist. This means that the only people who can potentially benefit from the Creation Museum as a source of income are people who are, to put it politely, fucking insane. Most of the money that the museum makes goes straight into the pockets of Ken Ham and his fellow major stakeholders. This museum does not benefit the public at all. It has a steep rate of admission, and it is not a benefit for the community of Petersburg, Kentucky at all. It might bring a little bit of side business here and there. People might go to Wendy's nearby after going to the Creation Museum, especially since most people who do tour it, ironically, go and get really baked beforehand, so they're going to have the munchies afterwards. But aside from a steady stream of stoned people coming out of the Creation Museum, this has not led to astronomical job growth, and certainly this has not created lots of high-paying jobs. It was not worth the $54 million in tax breaks that it received, and it has produced no public good, nor will it ever. So far as subsidies and tax breaks go, the example of Ken Ham bilking the state of Kentucky is still not as egregious as, say, the fact that it is almost impossible for alternative energy companies to get major subsidies, whereas oil companies are inundated with them. Flooded, to use a term that would be near and dear to the heart of Ken Ham. If you think that all of this is greasy, then you too think that neoliberalism is a disease and must perish. Ken Ham is going to illuminate us yet further with his greed and his willingness to further bilk the taxpayers of one of the poorest states in the country. Let's see what he has in mind. After having successfully bilked the state of Kentucky once, and with his internet fame at an all-time high, Ken Ham decided to start another private fundraiser for yet another very profitable pet project. This time he decided to build a full-scale replica of Noah's Ark in Kentucky, and he set out to raise $29 million. Somehow he managed to fall vastly short of that sum, and the state of Kentucky gave him $18 million to make sure that it happened. I could potentially see a state stepping in to give someone $18 million if they tried and failed to raise, say, $150 million or some large sum. But Ken Ham did not even get close to halfway to his goal, yet the state, still under Steve Beshear, was willing to step up and foot the bill. That is beyond egregious. And between this and Steve Beshear's earlier munificence to Ken Ham, those two things alone are enough to make him an F-tier governor, regardless of whatever else he may have done. And for context, at the same time that this happened, on July 31st, 2014, when Kentucky gave the money to Mr. Ham, the Kentucky legislature the same year voted to cut both K-12 funding and university funding. So the state of Kentucky had its priorities straight, and really made a great decision. And just like the Creation Museum, the Ark Encounter is a for-profit venture from an organization which has an activist streak, yet tries to claim that it's neither a church nor a civic organization, except when those things get better tax results, as we'll see. And that will eventually lead to Mr. Ham's downfall. But let us not skip ahead. In February of 2014, Bill Nye agreed to debate Ken Ham at the Creation Museum. While Bill Nye kicked the ever-living shit out of Ken Ham, creationists around the world were supposedly inspired, according to Mr. Ham, and this is how he raised the majority of the money for the Ark Encounter. Yet, as we have already seen, most of the money that went to fund the project ended up coming from the taxpayers of Kentucky. If Ken Ham was telling at least a partial truth, that is, that his fundraising went up after the debate, then that is indeed depressing and deserves many, many shots of whiskey to really process. In 2015, Kentucky got a new governor, Republican Matt Bevin. Bevin ran explicitly as an ally of Ken Ham and the Ark Encounter. So you might think that everything will be peachy keen for Ken Ham, and in the short term, you would be exactly right. Bevin, by the way, is one of the bigger right-wing asshole governors in the nation, or at least he was when he was still in office. He's not quite on the level of someone like a Rick Snyder, but that was not for lack of effort. This guy put in place right-to-work laws, he massively cut education spending, and did all kinds of other fucked up stuff while governor of Kentucky. He has since lost his seat, but not before his administration actually did something somewhat positive that we'll get to. One redeeming feature of his administration, which is yet to come. Feel the suspense. Another unfortunate feature of neoliberalism at the local and state level is that communities often prostitute themselves in order to get corporate business. Sometimes towns will offer Cabela's free water, road access, and tax exemption for 30 years, for instance, if they are to move into their town, and then create a handful of minimum wage jobs before shutting up shop before they ever have to pay a dime in local taxes. Also, sometimes businesses are so well connected that they actually get to collect their own sales tax or part of the income of their employees. Williamstown, Kentucky was the next willful victim of Ken Ham, and they gave this man the world. They gave him almost 100 acres near downtown for just $1. The Ark Encounter Center is located a mere half-mile from downtown, so very easy walking distance. And he got all of this for $1. So far, he's only used about half of this available land, so there's lots of room to grow on at Ark Encounter. The town is having some regrets, by the way, that we'll get to, but Ken Ham obviously is not. They gave him $175,000 in cash to help promote, to make sure that he wants to go with them. And they issued him $62 million in unsecured bonds, meaning money that they don't have, and arranged for him to repay via the diversion of sales tax. So rather than giving his sales tax to the state, he can instead direct most of it back to the city to pay those unsecured bonds. He is also able to collect 2% of what his workers make in a kind of private fiefdom tax, and then use that to help pay off some of these unsecured bonds as well. Fucking insanity. Needless to say, the prosperity never came to Williamstown, and to date, there has been no real benefit for the town of having Ken Ham around. If anything, it has actually hurt local business. Some of the stores which thought that the new surge of visitors would help them have not gotten any benefits. And a couple of local restaurants, at least one which opened not far from the park, Ken Ham enticed to move into the park, thus putting it out of reach of all of the actual people who live in Williamstown. To get into Ark Encounter, you have to pay about $75. So if you wanted to eat at this new hot dog restaurant, which used to be a local attraction, you'd have to pay Ken Ham $75 and then buy your food. So this turned out to be an absolutely terrible deal for the people of Williamstown, Kentucky. If you want to learn more about that, I highly suggest that you watch the documentary We Believe in Dinosaurs. And here it is, a life-size replica of Noah's Ark as described in the Old Testament. Of course, such a boat could not really exist in the water because wood does not have the tensile strength to support a structure of that size, but never mind. I do have to say, as a side note, that the craftsmen who helped to build this did an excellent job and were clearly an extremely talented and dedicated group of people. It's too bad that their talents were put to use in service of enriching a charlatan, and also that their talents were used to spread propaganda and lies to the general public. So I would like to both congratulate and excoriate the people who helped to make Ken Ham's dream a reality. So thank you, fuck you, bye. But everybody else stick around because we got more to talk about. Despite being heavily subsidized by state and local government, Ken Ham announced in 2016 that his company would only hire Christians. That's not a huge problem for most of the people in Kentucky, most of whom are Christians. It's one of the more religious states. However, it is a clear violation of church and state, and for that reason, this has been a huge issue for many groups which advocate the separation of church and state, some of whom are religious and some of whom are secularist. That being said, another major issue is not only does one have to be a Christian, but more to the point, one has to be a creationist, sign a statement of faith, and also talk about what church they go to, and it has to be approved by Ken Ham as being a, quote, Bible-believing church. So, not only is this potentially illegal, but it's also deeply unethical, and did I mention completely useless to many of the local residents who otherwise might be able to get work at this park. But now they can't unless they are literally insane. So, again, what good does this provide? Who among the people of Kentucky benefits from the existence of this project? What benefit has Ken Ham brought to his community, the community that gave him the shirt off his back, literally speaking? So, you might think that things look good for Ken Ham. He's got it made. But heading into the summer of 2017, shortly after opening, Ken found that the Ark Encounter was not very profitable, that it took a lot of overhead to keep the damn thing open, and that people weren't showing up in the expected numbers. So what he decided to do is to shift his tax burden by making it a non-profit rather than a for-profit business. So he sold it to himself and another holding company for $10. The problem with that is that while this does help him with federal taxes, this very much pissed off the state of Kentucky. And so Kentucky canceled the $18 million in state's sales tax revenue for breach of contract. Ken Ham tried to protest this, but the state held firm. So this is what Matt Bevin's administration did. It would appear that Governor Bevin had very little to do with it, but his administration did do the right thing, so bully for them. Even sometimes the absolute worst people have moments where they deliver something of value, so thank you to the relevant officials in this case. Typically speaking, one of the characteristics of a boat is that it does well when presented with the threat of water. Boats are supposed to be more or less waterproof. Well, Ken Ham's Ark was apparently accurate in terms of being a ship, except that he forgot to make sure that it was waterproof. The Ark Encounter suffered water damage, and when his insurance company decided not to pay out, reasonably enough in this case, Ken Ham decided to sue them. In general, I absolutely despise insurance companies, and I always hate the so-called act of God clause, where they claim that a flood is an act of God and therefore not covered by insurance because it's an unforeseen catastrophe or whatever it might be. But in this case, it would be ironic as hell if they pulled the act of God card on Ken Ham. And I'm very glad that they have not paid out to him, and I hope that they never do. I hope Ken Ham continues to waste money in courts trying to extract money, and he never gets anywhere. By 2019, Matt Bevin's right-wing policies had incurred deep unpopularity, and he was ousted in favor of Andy Beshear, the son of Steve Beshear. Up to this point, the new Governor Beshear has shown no interest in restoring any of Ken Ham's lost tax breaks or in offering him further subsidies for his business. With any luck, not only will Andy Beshear refuse to grant Ken Ham any new tax privileges, but he will also not renew the existing ones when they come up for review and renewal. One can dream, but we should never forget that Andy Beshear is a Kentucky Democrat, and that as such he is rather limited in terms of what he might be willing to do. That being said, if he is willing to recognize the separation of church and state, then that alone will make him a better governor than his moron father. The state of Kentucky itself has given Ken Ham $72 million. The town of Williamstown has given him $62 million in bonds, plus 100 acres. That is quite enough. Ken Ham does not deserve a cent more of American money, especially in the state of Kentucky, which he has already bled dry. As I mentioned at the outset, Kentucky can ill afford this wastage when so many of its citizens are themselves dealing with poverty. In the town of Hazard, 30.5% of the population lives below the poverty line. The state of Kentucky has to subsidize the pay of teachers who go to Hazard because the conditions are so rough and the community around it is so difficult to live in. There are other places in Kentucky which are almost as poor as Hazard and almost as difficult to live in. All of these places could use some sort of an economic stimulus. This would be a much better use of the resources that Kentucky wasted on an Australian creationist nut job. The state of Kentucky could even experiment with a kind of UBI, similar to what Alaska has with its oil revenue. Kentucky has a lot of well-off visitors who do the Bourbon Trail or who visit Lexington and Louisville each year to do horse racing. They could charge a tax at such events and maybe use that tax to fund a small UBI. In rural Kentucky, in a place like Hazard or Wolverine, even $100 or $150 a month might go a long way. It might mean the difference between going hungry and not going hungry, between being able to afford heat in the winter or not, something of that nature. I'm not saying that the state of Kentucky can or will make a big investment that would actually help people. But if they're going to spend large sums of money anyway, they might as well do something that would actually benefit people who live in the state in a meaningful sense. So why not invest in the citizens rather than in some asshole who is there to take your money and enrich himself? Until next time, I'm Spirit of Thersites, so remember to always research what is going on in the world and smarten the fuck up.